What if the person pulling away from you is not actually leaving, but battling things within themselves that you cannot see? And what if the very distance that confuses you is also the clearest sign that something meaningful still exists beneath it? If this made you pause and think, take a moment to reflect, because sometimes clarity comes not just from hearing something, but from feeling understood. Consistency, in the context of an avoidant, rarely shows up as constant closeness. Instead, it reveals itself in something far more subtle, the pattern of return. At first glance, their distance may feel like rejection, as if each withdrawal quietly confirms that you matter less than you hoped. But if you observe more closely, a different pattern begins to form. They leave, yet they do not disappear entirely. They create space, yet something within them keeps pulling them back toward you. This return is not random. It is the quiet evidence of an internal struggle they have not yet learned to resolve. An avoidant does not retreat because connection is meaningless to them. They retreat because connection triggers something overwhelming, an exposure they are not prepared to maintain. So when they come back, even in small ways, it reflects a tension between their instinct to protect themselves and their desire to keep the bond alive. Indifference does not return to what it has already abandoned. Only something emotionally significant creates this cycle of distance and return. However, this consistency is not measured through words. It is rarely expressed through reassurance or direct clarity. Instead, it appears through behavior that repeats over time. They check in, even if briefly. They re-enter your space after silence, even if it feels awkward. They attempt, in their own limited way, to reconnect. These actions may feel insufficient, but they carry meaning when viewed as part of a larger pattern rather than isolated moments. The key lies in distinguishing between random reappearances and genuine emotional gravity. If their returns show subtle progression, slightly more openness, slightly less avoidance, slightly more presence, then what you are witnessing is not stagnation, but slow movement. Growth in such individuals is rarely dramatic. It is almost invisible, unfolding beneath layers of resistance. But consistency of return must also carry a sense of awareness. If they come back unchanged, repeating the same distance without any sign of reflection, then the pattern loses its depth. It becomes habit rather than struggle. True consistency is not just about coming back. It is about coming back with even the smallest shift, the faintest sign that something within them is beginning to change. Subtle vulnerability in an avoidant does not arrive openly. It does not announce itself with clarity or confession. It appears in fragments, small, almost unnoticeable shifts in their otherwise guarded presence. And if you are not attentive, you may overlook it entirely, mistaking it for randomness rather than recognizing it as something deeply intentional, yet restrained by fear. The avoidant has learned, often long before you entered their life, that exposure comes with a cost. To reveal emotion is to risk losing control, to invite uncertainty, to step into a space where outcomes cannot be predicted. So, they construct a version of themselves that remains composed, distant, and self-contained. But no structure is flawless. Beneath it, something human persists, quietly pressing against the surface. This is where subtle vulnerability begins to appear. It may show in the way they hesitate before changing the subject, as if they almost said something real, but pulled back at the last second. It may exist in a brief moment of honesty, a sentence spoken quickly without elaboration, as though they needed to release it but could not bear to stay with it. Sometimes it reveals itself through their reactions rather than their words, in the way certain topics affect them more than they admit, or how their silence carries more weight than indifference ever could. These moments are not comfortable for them. They often retreat soon after, restoring the distance that allows them to feel safe again. And this creates confusion, because what you experience is inconsistency, an opening followed by closure. But if you look beneath the pattern, you begin to see that the opening itself is significant. It is not something they offer easily, nor something they can sustain without effort. The meaning of this vulnerability lies not in its intensity, but in its existence at all. It shows that, despite their defenses, there is a part of them attempting to reach beyond what feels safe. And that attempt, however small, reflects an internal shift, a movement away from complete emotional avoidance and towards something more connected, even if they do not yet know how to remain there. Effort, when expressed by an avoidant, rarely aligns with the language most people expect. It does not arrive through frequent reassurance, long emotional conversations, or consistent verbal affirmation. Instead, it moves quietly through actions, often understated, sometimes easily dismissed, yet deeply revealing when observed without expectation. The avoidant has a complicated relationship with expression. Words require exposure, and exposure threatens the sense of control they depend on to feel secure. So, rather than speaking what they feel, they translate it into behavior. They may not tell you that you matter, but they show up in moments that require presence. They may not clearly express care, but they respond when something important arises. Their effort exists, but it speaks in a language that is indirect, almost hidden beneath simplicity. This can create a sense of imbalance. You may find yourself listening for words that never fully come, while overlooking the consistency of what they do. Because in many ways, actions feel less definitive, less reassuring. Words create clarity, while actions require interpretation. And with an avoidant, interpretation becomes essential. You begin to notice patterns. They remember details you assumed they ignored. They make time, even if it is limited, in ways that disrupt their usual preference for distance. They adjust subtly to accommodate your presence in their life. None of this is loud or obvious. It does not demand recognition, but it is not accidental either. What makes this effort meaningful is not its size, but its resistance to their own nature. For someone who instinctively withdraws, any movement toward connection requires energy. It requires them to step, even briefly, outside the comfort of emotional detachment. And that step, however small, carries weight precisely because it goes against what feels natural to them. Yet, this form of effort must be understood within limits. If actions remain minimal and never evolve, if they begin to feel like mere gestures rather than genuine attempts, then their meaning begins to fade. True effort is not static. Even in its quiet form, it should show signs of expansion, more presence, more consistency, a gradual willingness to engage beyond what once felt possible. Fear, in an avoidant, does not present itself clearly as fear. It disguises itself as distance, as independence, as a quiet insistence that they simply need space or prefer things uncomplicated. And because of this disguise, it is often misinterpreted as indifference. But beneath that surface lies something far more complex. A nervous system that has learned to associate closeness with a loss of control, with emotional overwhelm, with something that feels difficult to manage. When they begin to pull away, it is rarely because the connection lacks meaning. In fact, the opposite is often true. The more something begins to matter, the more it activates the very fears they have spent years avoiding. Intimacy for them is not just connection, it is exposure. It brings them face to face with parts of themselves they do not fully understand, emotions they cannot easily regulate, and a vulnerability that feels unfamiliar, even threatening. So, distance becomes their way of restoring balance. It is not a calculated attempt to hurt or confuse, but an instinctive response to internal pressure. When emotions rise beyond what they can comfortably process, they retreat, not from you as a person, but from what the connection is awakening within them. This is why their withdrawal can feel sudden and disproportionate, as if something invisible has shifted without explanation. What makes this dynamic difficult is that the fear remains unspoken. They may not even fully recognize it themselves. Instead, it translates into behaviors that appear detached, less communication, reduced presence, a subtle emotional shutdown. To someone on the receiving end, it feels like a quiet disappearance, one that leaves questions without answers. But if this distance is rooted in fear rather than indifference, there are traces of that truth within it. You may notice hesitation instead of finality, a sense that they have not completely let go. Their connection does not vanish. It becomes restrained, as though something is holding it back rather than erasing it. Understanding this distinction changes the meaning of their behavior. It does not excuse inconsistency, nor does it remove the emotional impact it has on you. But it reveals that what appears as a lack of care may, in reality, be a struggle with the intensity of caring itself. Trust for an avoidant is not something that appears all at once or arrives suddenly. It develops slowly, almost reluctantly, as if each layer must first negotiate with the part of them that resists closeness. In the beginning, their connection may feel limited, controlled, even somewhat distant. They reveal only what feels safe, keeping the deeper parts of themselves carefully out of reach and protected. But over time, if something genuine is present, there is a gradual shift, so subtle that it can easily be overlooked if you are only searching for obvious change. This increase in trust does not announce itself through dramatic openness or clear declarations. Instead, it emerges through small adjustments in how they relate to you, changes that are quiet but meaningful. They begin to linger a little longer in conversations they once avoided. They share slightly more than before, even if it still feels incomplete or cautious. The distance that once appeared immediately may begin to take longer to form, as though they are learning in quiet increments to tolerate the closeness they once resisted so strongly. What makes this process significant is that it often unfolds against their natural instinct. The avoidant is wired to maintain control through emotional distance, so any movement toward trust requires them to remain present in situations that feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. And rather than making a sudden leap, they move in careful, measured steps, testing, retreating, then returning again with a slightly increased willingness to stay. You may notice that their reactions begin to soften over time. Situations that once caused immediate withdrawal now lead to brief pauses instead. They may still need space, but it becomes less absolute, less final, and less abrupt. There is a sense that they are not just escaping the connection, but trying in their own way to remain within it without becoming overwhelmed. Trust, in this context, is not measured by perfection or consistency in the usual sense. It is measured by direction. If their behavior shows a slow but steady movement toward openness, more presence, more honesty, more emotional availability, even in small and uneven doses, then something within them is gradually evolving. The walls are not disappearing entirely, but they are becoming less rigid and less impenetrable. And this is where patience must be paired with awareness, because gradual trust is meaningful only when it continues to grow over time. If time passes and nothing shifts, if the same distance repeats without any visible change, then what appears as slowness may actually be stagnation. True trust, even in its quietest and most subtle form, leaves a trace of progression, however faint or difficult to notice it may be. It carries a sense that something is moving forward, even if that movement is slow, uneven, and at times almost invisible. Respect for your boundaries, especially from someone who instinctively creates distance, carries a meaning that is often underestimated or misunderstood. At first it may seem like the bare minimum, something that should exist in any connection without question. But in the inner world of an avoidant, where closeness itself can feel intrusive, the way they respond to your limits reveals far more than simple politeness. It reflects how they perceive you in relation to their need for control and emotional safety. An avoidant is highly sensitive to anything that feels like pressure or expectation. When they sense demands that move faster than their internal capacity, their instinct is to withdraw and create distance. So when you express a boundary, whether it is a need for clarity, space, or emotional consistency, it presents them with a choice. They can either retreat further to protect themselves, or they can attempt, however imperfectly, to adjust their behavior in order to maintain the connection. If they show respect for that boundary, even in subtle or understated ways, it signals something important. It means they are not simply operating from avoidance, but are becoming aware of the space between their needs and yours. They may not always meet your expectations fully or consistently, but they acknowledge them. And that acknowledgement requires a level of presence that goes beyond simple detachment. This respect may not appear as agreement or immediate change. Instead, it often shows up in restraint and awareness. They avoid crossing lines you have made clear, even if it takes effort. They respond, even if minimally, when you communicate something important. They make small adjustments that indicate they are considering your position rather than dismissing it entirely. These are not dramatic or obvious gestures, but they reveal an underlying recognition that your experience matters. What makes this meaningful is that it challenges their default pattern. To respect a boundary, they must remain engaged enough to remember it, to consider it, and to act with some level of intention. This is not something that happens in complete emotional absence or indifference. It suggests that despite their discomfort with closeness, they are not entirely disconnected from its impact. Yet, respect must be consistent to hold its value. If boundaries are acknowledged one moment and ignored the next, then what appears as awareness turns into inconsistency. True respect does not require perfection, but it does require reliability over time. Even in small ways, it should demonstrate that your limits are not obstacles to them, but part of the reality they are willing to navigate and adapt to. Moments of genuine presence, especially from someone who is often distant, carry a weight that is easy to underestimate. At first, they may appear ordinary, just a conversation, a shared silence, or a brief instance where everything feels natural and unforced. But when these moments come from an avoidant, they are not as effortless as they seem on the surface. They represent a temporary suspension of the internal defenses that usually keep them at a distance from emotional closeness. An avoidant rarely exists fully in the present when connection is involved. Part of them is often observing, managing, or quietly preparing for withdrawal. So when that internal tension softens, even briefly, what emerges is a version of them that is unguarded in a way they cannot consistently maintain. In these moments, their attention is not divided or fragmented. They are not pulling away or holding something back. Instead, they are fully there with you, without the usual layers of hesitation or resistance. You may notice it in the quality of their focus and engagement. They listen without distraction, respond without deflection, and engage without the subtle signals of retreat that often accompany their behavior. There is a steadiness to their presence. There is a sense that, for that period of time, they are not negotiating distance or planning an exit, and within that steadiness, a different depth becomes visible, one that contrasts sharply with their more detached and guarded state. These moments are not frequent, and they are rarely prolonged or sustained for long periods. Afterward, they may return to their usual pattern of distance and restraint, which can make the experience feel confusing or even misleading. But the significance of genuine presence lies in its authenticity, not in how long it lasts. It reveals what exists beneath their defenses, even if they cannot remain there consistently or comfortably. What matters is whether these moments carry a sense of sincerity rather than performance. If their presence feels grounded and real, if it aligns with their actions afterward, even in small ways, then it reflects something genuine rather than something fleeting. It shows that connection is not beyond their capacity or ability. It is simply something they struggle to sustain over time, and that distinction matters more than it may initially seem. Over time, these moments can also begin to shift. They may become slightly more frequent, slightly less fragile, as if the space between distance and closeness is beginning to stabilize in small ways. And within that subtle change, you begin to see not just isolated instances, but the possibility of a more continuous connection slowly starting to take shape, even if it remains imperfect. The inner conflict within an avoidant is not always visible from the outside, yet it shapes nearly every movement they make within a connection. It is the quiet tension between two opposing forces, the desire to come closer and the instinct to pull away. One part of them recognizes the value of connection, feels the pull of it, and may even long for its stability and comfort. But another part, often stronger and more deeply rooted, associates that same closeness with discomfort, loss of control, or emotional overwhelm. And so they exist in a state of internal division. This conflict does not express itself through clear communication or direct explanation. Instead, it appears as inconsistency in their behavior. They move towards you, then hesitate. They open slightly, then close again. They create moments of connection only to follow them with distance. To someone experiencing this from the outside, it can feel confusing, frustrating, and even contradictory. But from within their perspective, it is not contradiction. It is an ongoing struggle between opposing needs and emotional responses. You may begin to notice signs of this tension if you look beyond the surface of their behavior. There is often a pause before they withdraw, as if something within them is resisting the impulse to leave. There may be moments where they seem almost ready to express something deeper, only to redirect or minimize it at the last second. Even their distance can carry a certain emotional weight, a sense that it is not entirely voluntary but driven by something they have not yet fully understood or mastered. What makes this inner conflict meaningful is that it reveals the presence of both forces at once. If there were only avoidance, there would be no return, no hesitation, no moments of closeness at all. And if there were only desire for connection, there would be no distance or withdrawal. The coexistence of both indicates that they are not emotionally absent or indifferent. They are divided within themselves. Over time, this conflict can begin to evolve. The side that seeks connection may slowly gain strength, gradually influencing their choices and behavior in subtle ways. You might see them hesitate less before staying, withdraw less intensely, or attempt to remain present even when it feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar. These are not sudden transformations, but gradual shifts in balance. But this only holds meaning if the conflict leads somewhere. If the tension remains unchanged, repeating the same cycle without movement or growth, then it becomes a loop rather than a process of development. True inner conflict, when engaged with and processed over time, creates friction that eventually leads to change, even if that change is slow, uneven, and difficult to recognize at first.